punishments, such as amputations of people's hands for theft, public executions for murder and adultery as well. Well, let's discuss all this with Zainab Chaudry, a civil, human and women's rights activist. Thank you for joining us. Let's just start from the beginning. I mean, what does the Quran say about women's rights?
Well, thank you so much for having me. First of all, it's really important to note that Sharia, for example, is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Islam. And the fact that, it's not necessarily a set of laws or statutes, but rather guidance, as you mentioned earlier, that's compiled from the Quran and from the Hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that are intended to help Muslims live a responsible way of life, a moral way of life. The term itself is translated as the path to water or the way to water. And in the Quran specifically, there are very clear verses that stipulate that women have rights as far as, their autonomy, their agency. There is no difference between men and women as far as our relationship to God. And we're promised the same reward for good deeds as we are for bad deeds. In the second chapter, Surah Baqarah, verse 228, God tells us clearly that for women are rights over men similar to those as men have over women as well. So there are equal moral agency and we have equal reward as well.
OK, so legal and financial rights as well. So where does the gap lie in terms of the interpretation of this? Why is it that some countries have a much stricter interpretation of Sharia rather than others?
Well, look, similar to canon law in Catholicism and Halasha in Judaism, Sharia itself comprises a wide variety of topics, like, for example, how to pray, how to live your daily lives, charitable giving, banking, things of that nature. And there are multiple schools of thought within Islam, right? It's not a monolith. It's a faith of over 1.5 billion people around the world. And there are numerous interpretations of Sharia. The interpretations of Sharia is, it varies depending on the school of legal jurisprudence, for example, that an individual follows. And the fiqh, or the interpretation that is established by a body of scholars, it can vary. It differs. The Taliban's brand of Islam is not reflective or representative of the world's 1.5 billion Muslims. And I think that's where part of the misunderstandings come from when these kind of stories are reported.
So which way could it go and which way would be the most attractive in terms of a westernized population that we've seen now in the past 20 years in Afghanistan, maybe compared to, say, the Iranian view of Sharia law?
Well, look, one thing that's really important to establish is that regardless of what the Western perception is of Sharia law, the important thing is that Sharia law the Sharia concept of Sharia is implemented the way that it's intended to be implemented. For example, in Islam, the first word that was revealed in the Islamic holy text, the Quran, was the word ikra, which means to read. This word was a command for Muslims to be educated, to gain knowledge. There is no distinction between men and women in terms of who is, more viable to gain that knowledge. This is a commandment for all people, regardless of gender. Now, the implementation of, the interpretation of Sharia needs to be made in such a way that it is equitable for women and men. Now, we don't know what's going to unfold in Afghanistan. There's a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty. And I think that's part of what's creating a lot of, questions in terms of what the future of Afghanistan is going to look like, especially for women and girls who historically have been marginalized and whose rights have been violated under the law.
And actually practically under house arrest during the Taliban rule. Just very briefly, how big a setback would it be if the religious police were to be resurrected?
Well, look, it's really important that the enforcement of any laws is in compliance with the intention of what that specific part of Sharia is. In Islam, it's very clear that there's no compulsion in religion. And there needs to be a set of societal norms in place that enable the society to be able to function in a way that, they can practice and live out their faith without living in fear or without having their rights be violated. And so the next few weeks will be very critical in seeing how what's going to unfold in Afghanistan.
OK, Zainab Chaudry, really good to have you on. Thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News.